At my grandfather's funeral, my uncle ripped the last will and testament out of the attorney's hands and fed it to the flames of the memorial candles while my grandfather's casket sat barely 10 feet away. When I tried to stop him, he struck me across the face with the back of his hand and shoved me, 8 months pregnant, into the solid oak corner of the casket platform. I collapsed onto the cold chapel floor, blood running down my chin, violent contractions tearing through my body, while my own flesh and blood stepped around me to shake his hand and congratulate him on his inheritance. They believed that one small flame could erase my grandfather's final wishes forever. They had absolutely no idea that inside the pocket of my black maternity dress, pressed against the unborn daughter they almost killed, sat a sealed envelope that was about to bury all 3 of them under the full crushing weight of Tennessee law. Before I share the painful details of my story, I have a quick question for you. Where in the world are you watching this from right now, and what time is it over there? Drop it in the comments below. I absolutely love seeing where my global family is tuning in from. It gives me so much strength. Go ahead and type your city and your time right now, because what you are about to hear next will completely shock you. My name is Abigail. I am 27 years old, and for most of my life, only one human being in my entire family ever truly loved me. That man was my grandfather, Walter. My father, his younger son, died in a highway accident when I was 9 years old. My mother remarried within a year and moved across the country to start a brand new family, a family that apparently had no room in it for a grieving little girl. So it was Grandpa Walter who took me in. It was Grandpa Walter who raised me on his 200-acre cattle farm in the rolling green hills outside Franklin, Tennessee. He taught me how to drive a tractor before I could ride a bike. He sat in the front row of every school play. He worked that land with his bare hands for over 50 years, and he used to tell me that the farm was not dirt and fences. He said it was proof that an honest man could build something that outlives him. But where there is an honest man, there is usually a greedy shadow standing right behind him, and in our family, that shadow had a name. My Uncle Gerald. Gerald was my father's older brother, and he was everything my father and grandfather were not. He was loud, vain, allergic to hard work, and absolutely convinced that the world owed him a fortune simply because he existed. He ran a failing roofing business that survived on excuses and unpaid invoices. His wife, my Aunt Sandra, was a woman who measured human beings by the brand of their handbags, and their son, my cousin Tyler, was a 30-year-old man who had never held a job for longer than a season, a man whose greatest daily achievement was rolling off the couch before noon. For my entire childhood, Gerald treated the farm like a vending machine. He only appeared when he needed something: a loan for a new truck, money to cover Tyler's gambling debts, cash to keep Sandra's boutique from collapsing for the 4th time. He never came for Thanksgiving. He never came for Grandpa's birthday. But the moment a bank called about an overdue payment, his car would come roaring up that gravel driveway in a cloud of dust and entitlement. And every time he left with a check in his pocket, he would look at me, the orphan girl living in what he considered his future house, with a cold resentment that made my skin crawl. He used to say it openly at family gatherings. He would point his beer bottle at the fields and announce that one day all of it would be his because he was the firstborn son, and that was simply the natural order of things. I never argued. I just worked. I put myself through nursing school by taking night shifts as a hospital aide, scrubbing floors and emptying bedpans until 4 in the morning, then driving to class on truck stop coffee and stubbornness. Grandpa offered to pay for everything, but I refused to take a single dollar from him because I had already watched Gerald bleed him for years, and I swore I would never be another mouth chewing on that good man's generosity. I graduated with honors. I became a registered nurse at a major hospital in Nashville. I met my husband, Caleb, a steady, gentle giant of a man who builds houses for a living and who fell in love with the farm almost as fast as he fell in love with me. We got married under the big oak tree behind the farmhouse, and my grandfather cried harder than anyone that day. Then, 3 years ago, everything changed. Grandpa Walter suffered a stroke at the age of 81. The doctors said he would need full-time care, monitoring, medication, and months of therapy. Within a week, Caleb and I packed up our apartment in Nashville and moved into the farmhouse. I rearranged my entire life around that man. I took night shifts at the hospital so I could spend my days caring for him. I cooked his meals, managed his medications, drove him to every appointment, and did his physical therapy exercises with him twice a day until his left hand worked again. I paid for the things insurance would not cover out of my own pocket, hundreds of dollars every single month, and I never once mentioned it to him because his dignity mattered more to me than money. Do you know how many times Gerald visited his dying father in those 3 years? 4. 4 visits in 3 years, and every single one of them ended with a request for money. The roof on his lake house, a new transmission for Tyler, a tax problem with the roofing business, and Grandpa, soft-hearted to a fault when it came to his eldest son, kept writing checks, hoping each one would finally buy him a little bit of love. But then, about a year before he passed, I was organizing Grandpa's desk and found a stack of bank statements that made my blood run cold. There were checks I did not recognize, large ones, thousands of dollars at a time, made out to cash, with a signature that looked like Grandpa's handwriting the way a counterfeit bill looks like money, shaky in the wrong places, confident in the wrong places. I showed them to Grandpa, expecting him to be confused. Instead, that old man looked at the papers for a long, quiet moment, and then he looked up at me with eyes that were perfectly clear and unbearably sad. He said, "I know, sweetheart. I have known for a while. I just needed someone else to see it too." The next morning, my grandfather asked me to drive him into town, to the law office of Harlan Whitfield, an estate attorney he had known for 40 years. I waited outside that office for 2 hours. When Grandpa came out, he was leaning on his cane, but his spine was straighter than I had seen it since the stroke. Over the following weeks, he went back 3 more times. He had a complete medical evaluation done, with a letter from his physician confirming that his mind was sharp and sound. He signed a brand new last will and testament in front of 2 independent witnesses and a notary, and at his own insistence, the entire signing was recorded on video, with Grandpa looking straight into the camera and stating his wishes in his own steady voice. He left the farm, the equipment, the land, and his savings of roughly $300,000 to me. He left Gerald his fishing boat and a gift of $10,000 because even after everything, he could not bring himself to leave his son with nothing. But he also added one final condition, a no-contest clause written in plain language. If any heir attempted to challenge, conceal, or destroy this will, that person would forfeit every penny and every item left to them. A week later, Grandpa called me into his study. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it in his careful, old-fashioned handwriting. He told me it was a certified copy of the will and that the original was locked in Mr. Whitfield's fireproof vault along with the video, and then he said something I will never forget for as long as I live. He held my hand, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Abigail, when they put me in the ground, I want you to carry this in your pocket. I know exactly what my son is going to do that day, and I want you to stand back and let him do it." I thought he was being dramatic. I thought no human being on this earth could possibly be that shameless. I was wrong. My grandfather passed away peacefully on a soft spring morning at the age of 84, in his own bed, in the house he built, holding my hand. By then I was 8 months pregnant with his great-granddaughter. The night before he died, he placed his weathered palm on my belly, smiled, and whispered that he was sorry he would miss meeting her, but that he had already taken care of her future. I cried myself to sleep that night. I had no idea those words were not just sentiment. They were a battle plan. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning at a chapel in Franklin. Because Grandpa had relatives in Oregon and old Army friends scattered across 3 countries, the funeral home set up a camera on a tripod at the back of the chapel and live-streamed the entire service. Over 200 people were watching that broadcast from their homes. Remember that camera. That little red blinking light is about to become the most important character in this story. Gerald arrived 40 minutes late to his own father's funeral, driving a brand new luxury pickup truck that I knew for a fact he could not afford. He wore an expensive black suit and performed his grief like a stage actor, dabbing dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Sandra sat beside him in a white designer blouse, scrolling on her phone through half the service. Tyler slouched in the pew, reeking of cigarettes, and I watched his eyes crawl across the memorial display table at the front, where Grandpa's medals, his photographs, and his gold pocket watch, a family piece appraised at $11,000, were laid out in loving arrangement. I sat in the front row with Caleb's jacket around my shoulders, my swollen feet aching, my daughter kicking gently inside me, and I said goodbye to the only parent I ever really had. Caleb was not beside me that morning. He had stayed behind at the farmhouse to set up the reception for 60 guests, planning to join me at the burial. I have replayed that decision 1,000 times, because what happened next happened without him there to protect me. When the service ended, Mr. Whitfield, the attorney, rose from the back row, straightened his suit, and walked to the front. He politely announced to the family that a formal reading of the will was scheduled for Monday morning at his office. That was all he said, one scheduling announcement. But Gerald heard the word will, and something feral flickered across his face. He stood up in front of the entire chapel and loudly demanded to see the document right then and there. Mr. Whitfield calmly declined and explained that there was a proper legal process. And that is when my Uncle Gerald, in front of his father's open casket, in front of 100 mourners, in front of a live broadcast camera, lunged forward and ripped the leather folder out of the elderly attorney's hands. The chapel went dead silent. Gerald flipped open the folder, scanned the first page, and I watched the color travel up his neck like rising floodwater. His hands started shaking. His jaw clenched. And then he read, out loud, in a voice strangled with rage, the sentence that gave the farm to me. He looked up and his eyes found me in the front row, and what I saw in them was not grief and not even greed. It was hatred, pure, ancient, festering hatred. He started screaming. He called me a scheming little leech. He told the entire chapel that I had spent 3 years whispering poison into a senile old man's ear, isolating him, manipulating him, turning a confused invalid against his own blood. He said the will was garbage, that it was fraud, that everyone present was a witness to a crime. And then, while 100 people watched in frozen horror, my Uncle Gerald held the pages of my grandfather's last will and testament over the flame of the tall bronze memorial candle that stood beside the casket, and he set them on fire. He held the burning papers up like a trophy while they curled and blackened, and then he dropped them into the metal flower urn beside the display table where they collapsed into glowing ash. He turned to the stunned crowd, spread his arms, and announced that there was no will, that he was the firstborn son, and that the farm, the money, and everything his father owned now passed to him by the natural order of things. I do not remember deciding to stand up. I just remember being on my feet, 8 months pregnant, moving toward him, hearing my own voice shouting that he had just committed a crime in front of witnesses. I reached for the urn, and my Uncle Gerald turned around and backhanded me across the face with his full strength. The crack echoed off the chapel walls. My head snapped sideways, my lips split open, and before I could even regain my balance, he grabbed my shoulders and shoved me away from him with the disgust of a man swatting an insect. My body twisted as I fell, and the corner of the solid oak casket platform caught me directly across my pregnant belly. A white-hot blade of agony tore through my abdomen, unlike anything I have ever felt in my life. I hit the floor hard, my hands flying to my stomach, and I felt the warm blood from my lip dripping down onto my black maternity dress. And then, the first contraction hit me like a freight train, 2 months too early, and I started to scream. What I witnessed next, lying on that cold chapel floor in a spreading pool of my own blood, broke something inside me that has never fully healed. Nobody in my family moved to help me. My Aunt Sandra grabbed Tyler by the sleeve and yanked him backward, and I heard her hiss at him to step back before the blood reached their shoes. She actually lifted the hem of her white designer blouse away from me, away from her pregnant niece, convulsing in premature labor on the floor, as if I were a puddle of something filthy. Gerald stood over me, panting, and announced to the horrified mourners that I had fainted from grief, that I was always dramatic, that someone should fetch me a glass of water, and through the blur of tears and agony, I watched my cousin Tyler drift casually over to the memorial display table, glance around once, and slide my grandfather's gold pocket watch off the velvet cloth and into his suit pocket, while his grandfather's body lay 3 feet away. They were prepared to let me lose my daughter on that floor to protect a lie. In that moment, through contractions that felt like my body was being torn in half, the last childish hope I had ever carried about my family burned away with that will. My tears stopped. A cold, surgical clarity took their place. I pressed one hand against the sealed envelope in my pocket, the one my grandfather made me promise to carry, and I made a silent vow to my unborn daughter. We are going to survive this morning, and every person who stepped around us today is going to learn exactly what the natural order of things really looks like. Salvation came from a 70-year-old woman in a floral dress. Ruth, my grandfather's neighbor of 40 years, the woman who taught me to can peaches when I was 10, came shoving through the frozen crowd like a linebacker. She dropped to her knees beside me, pressed her cardigan against my bleeding lip, and with her other hand dialed 911. Then she called Caleb, and I heard her voice crack as she screamed into the phone the words that still echo in my nightmares. "Get to the chapel right now. They are killing her." Caleb was 12 minutes away. He made it in 7. The chapel doors flew open so hard that one of the hinges cracked, and my husband came through them like a storm given a body. Behind him rushed 2 Williamson County Sheriff's deputies who had been just down the street, and a pair of paramedics pulling a gurney. Caleb saw me on the floor, saw the blood, saw my hands clutching my belly, and the sound that came out of that gentleman was something I had never heard before and hope to never hear again. He dropped to his knees, cradled my face, and begged me to stay with him while the paramedics swarmed us and strapped monitors across my stomach to find our daughter's heartbeat. Gerald immediately stepped forward and switched on his performance voice. He told the deputies it was a tragic accident, that his poor niece was hysterical with grief and clumsy in her condition, that she had tripped on the carpet and everyone present saw it. He actually put his hand over his heart while he said it, and that was the moment my husband rose to his full height of 6 feet and 3 inches, looked my uncle dead in the eye, and pointed one trembling finger at the back of the chapel, at the camera, at the little red light that had never stopped blinking. The entire service was being broadcast live, Caleb said, his voice low and shaking with rage. 200 people just watched you burn that will. 200 people just watched you strike a pregnant woman. It is recorded, it is saved, and copies of it are already sitting in 200 homes. And before Gerald's gray, draining face could even form a response, old Mr. Whitfield stepped forward, adjusted his glasses, and delivered the single most devastating sentence I have ever heard spoken aloud. He informed my uncle, calmly and clearly, that the document he had just destroyed in front of witnesses was a certified copy, that the original will was locked in a fireproof vault at his firm, and that the entire signing had been preserved on notarized video at Walter's own request. My grandfather had predicted all of it. He had baited the trap with paper and let his own funeral spring it. The last thing I saw as the paramedics lifted me onto the gurney was a deputy turning my uncle around to face the wall, and Tyler frozen at the side exit with an officer's hand already extended toward his suit pocket, asking him to slowly remove what he had taken from the memorial table. The ambulance ride was 11 minutes of sirens, pain, and Caleb's hands wrapped around mine. At the hospital, everything became a blur of fluorescent lights and urgent voices. My blood pressure was crashing, and the monitors showed our daughter's heart rate stuttering from the trauma of the impact. The doctors did not hesitate. Within 40 minutes of arrival, I was under anesthesia for an emergency cesarean delivery. When I clawed my way back to consciousness hours later, the first thing I saw was Caleb beside my bed, hollow-eyed and unshaven, smiling through tears. Our daughter was alive. She weighed 4 pounds and 15 ounces. She was hooked to wires and tubes in the intensive care nursery, 2 months early, impossibly small, and breathing entirely on her own. A fighter. The nurses told me she came out with her tiny fists already clenched. The moment I knew my baby was stable, the grief and terror inside me crystallized into something colder and far more dangerous. I did not waste a single tear on my family. While my body healed from major surgery, an assistant district attorney for Williamson County sat down beside my hospital bed with a recorder and a legal pad, and I gave a statement so detailed and so calm that she stopped writing twice just to look at me. Within days, Gerald's lawyer began calling, fishing for a settlement, suggesting this was a private family tragedy best handled quietly, hinting that pressing charges against my own uncle would look vindictive. I looked at the district attorney and said 5 words: give them absolutely nothing, maximum charges. And the charges rained down like judgment. Gerald was charged with aggravated assault, elevated to its harshest degree under Tennessee law because his victim was a visibly pregnant woman, and the assault had directly caused premature labor. He was charged with tampering with and destroying evidence for burning a testamentary document in front of witnesses. Tyler was charged with felony theft for the gold pocket watch because its appraised value of $11,000 pushed it far beyond a petty crime. And when investigators began pulling threads, the entire rotten tapestry unraveled. A forensic accountant subpoenaed 6 years of my grandfather's bank records and matched them against the forged checks I had photographed and preserved a year earlier. The total came to roughly $260,000 stolen from a stroke survivor in his 80s. That meant felony charges for financial exploitation of an elderly adult. Several of those forged checks had been cashed by Tyler. Several more had been deposited directly into the account of Sandra's boutique, which earned my aunt her own charges as an accomplice, along with a charge for providing false statements to the deputies at the chapel when she swore under oath to their faces that I had simply tripped. But the criminal courts were only half of my grandfather's posthumous masterpiece. The probate hearing was where Gerald's world truly ended. Even from jail, he scraped together money for a lawyer to contest the will, claiming undue influence, claiming his father had been a confused invalid under my control. So the judge dimmed the courtroom lights and played the video, and there was my grandfather, sitting upright in Mr. Whitfield's office, sharp as a razor blade, reciting the date, the names of every sitting county commissioner, and the exact acreage of his farm, before looking straight into the camera and stating in his own unhurried voice that his estate would pass to the granddaughter who gave up her life to care for him. Then came the final twist of the knife, in Grandpa's own words. He said that if his son Gerald ever challenged, concealed, or destroyed this will, the no contest clause would activate, and Gerald would forfeit even the fishing boat and the $10,000 his father had left him out of mercy. My grandfather had left him one last lifeline, and Gerald had burned it himself, on camera, beside the casket. The judge validated the will in under 20 minutes. Then I turned off the money. every drop of it. The lake house Gerald's family had occupied rent-free for 12 years had belonged to my grandfather all along, which meant it now belonged to me. While they sat in county jail, unable to make bail, my attorney delivered a formal eviction notice, and 30 days later, their furniture, Tyler's gaming consoles, and Sandra's racks of designer clothes sat in the rain at the end of the driveway. Gerald's roofing equipment, stored for free in the north barn of my farm for a decade, was removed by a licensed crew and left at a storage facility with the unpaid bill in his name. And that shiny new pickup truck he drove to the funeral turned out to have been financed with a forged document listing my grandfather's tractors as collateral, so one phone call to the bank's fraud department sent a repossession truck to the impound lot. They had treated my grandfather like a vault and me like a servant, so I sealed the vault, changed the locks, and let them finally experience the natural order of things. 6 months later came the day of reckoning. I refused to sit in the same room with them or let their poison anywhere near my daughter, so the judge permitted me to appear through a secure video link. I sat in our sunlit farmhouse nursery, in my grandfather's old reading chair, rocking my healthy baby girl against my chest while Caleb stood behind me with his hands on my shoulders. On the screen, the camera panned across the defense table, and I felt absolutely nothing except a vast, quiet calm. Gerald, Sandra, and Tyler were unrecognizable. Gaunt, gray, dressed in matching Orange County jumpsuits, chained at the wrists, represented by a single exhausted public defender, because every dollar they had ever leached was gone. When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly into the camera and laid out 27 years of truth in a voice that never once wavered. Then, the prosecution played the funeral livestream on the courtroom screens in high definition. The burning pages. The backhand across my face. The shove. My pregnant body folding over the oak platform. Sandra yanking her blouse away from my blood. Tyler's hand sliding the gold watch into his pocket beside his grandfather's casket. The courtroom did not make a sound. I watched my aunt bury her face in her chained hands, and I watched my uncle finally understand that the confused old invalid he had robbed for 6 years had outthought him from beyond the grave. The judge showed no mercy, because none had been shown to me. Gerald received 12 years in state prison for aggravated assault against a pregnant woman and the financial exploitation of an elderly adult, with full restitution ordered. Tyler received 4 years for felony theft and forgery. Sandra received 3 years of strict probation, a permanent felony record, and a restitution order that swallowed her boutique whole, leaving her broke, unemployable, and alone in a rented room on the far side of town. I did not wait to watch the bailiffs lead them away. I simply reached out, closed the laptop, and listened to the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my life. Silence. Then my daughter yawned against my chest, and somewhere outside the nursery window, a breeze moved through the big oak tree my grandfather planted before I was born. We named her Willa, after Walter. She is healthy, she is loud, and she has her great-grandfather's stubborn chin. The gold pocket watch came home from the evidence locker last month, and it sits polished in a glass case on the mantel, waiting for the day she is old enough to hear this story and understand the man it belonged to. Every morning I drink my coffee on the porch he built, looking out over 200 acres of land that honest hands carved out of these hills, and I finally understand what my grandfather was really leaving me. It was never just a farm. It was proof, his final proof, that patience beats greed, that paper burns but truth does not, and that blood does not make a family. Loyalty does, showing up at 4 a.m. for 3 long years does. But standing where I am today, holding everything they tried to steal, I have to ask you, do you think I went too far by pressing every charge against my own uncle, my aunt, and my cousin? Or did they earn every single year behind those bars? What would you have done if you were lying on that chapel floor? Let me know in the comments below, and if my grandfather's last lesson moved you the way it still moves me. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon, because tomorrow I will be sharing another true story of justice that you will not believe.